Morning and welcome. My name is Darla Leslie and I'm a board member with the Native American Journalists Association, and I would like to welcome our next speaker, Paul Demain, who is the producer for News from IndianCountryTV.com and the editor of News from Indian Country. Paul has been a longtime member of the organization, past president, and today he will be speaking on the impact and personal and professional lives of Anime Aquash murder investigation. Paul Demain has Anime's daughter here, who will be also going over all the facts, finding facts that he had come across on his research. Welcome, Paul Demain.
Thank you, Darla, for the introduction. We have another person who's going to be joining with us shortly. He was sitting up here for a while ago, and maybe he got stage fright and left. But that's Attorney Barry Bacharach. Used to be the attorney for Leonard Peltier, so we want to welcome him when he comes in. He'll be following Denise here in terms of presentation. I wanted to start out this morning's presentation talking a little bit about something that's on my mind today, because I want to send my condolences to the family of Jean Moore, who is a Penobscot. She passed away last week at Indian Island, Maine. She lost her son in 1974, and her son's name was Johnny Moore. And Johnny Moore was in Wounded Knee in 1973. In 1974, he was called to Lincoln, Nebraska to testify in a Wounded Knee case, and he was found in the American Indian Movement barracks there in Lincoln, Nebraska, with his throat slit through the esophagus and a bone chip in his cheek. The local district attorney, who is running for attorney general, said he didn't want any problems with the case and ruled it a suicide because that's what everyone told him. It took Jeannie Moore several years until the state of Nebraska had the State Patrol conduct an internal investigation into the case, and the case was then relabeled a potential homicide. But it was several years later. Evidence had been destroyed, witnesses been scattered, and nothing has happened since in that particular case. I talked to her a few years ago. Very, very interesting human being, loving person, conceded that members of the American Indian Movement had declared her son a potential informant. They could not find his government severance check from the military service that she had sent him, and she thinks that that might have been the smoking gun that got him killed. She sent that check from Maine to him in Lincoln, Nebraska, because he said he was going to do some volunteer work there for the Wounded Knee trials, and ended up dead. Jeannie Moore passed away last week, but she knew that somebody cared about what had happened, because she said, "I didn't think anyone cared." Not too many years ago, maybe actually about 10 years ago now that I think about it, I had a similar discussion with a woman by the name of Cheryl Buswell Robinson from Detroit, Michigan, who I called up, and it would take an hour-long presentation to tell that particular story. But the bottom line was when I called her in Detroit, Michigan, and said, "I'm a Native journalist looking into the case of a black civil rights worker by the name of Perry Ray Robinson, who was murdered inside Wounded Knee after being identified as an informant." I was gathering information on him, and actually for almost 5 or 6 years, I knew that there was a black man buried there who had been shot, in the knee and buried, and I didn't know all the circumstances, but looking into it, he was another individual identified as an informant, and his remains remain there today in Wounded Knee with an alleged other 6 victims during that 1973 occupation. And so I wanted to let her know that somebody cared, because she cried when I called her up on the phone and says, I'm looking into this case, and I could hear her on the other end choking up a little bit, and she says, I didn't think anyone cared anymore. It's been 28 years, 27 years, whatever it was at the time. Over the course of this investigation into the passing and death and execution of Anime Piktuakwash, I've added 13 names to a list, on a short list, that I am sure were victims who were executed and killed internally within the organization. And in drawing my umbrella and what that says, I believe it explains some of the dynamics that we still deal with today in regards to some of the prominent names of those who belong to AIM, including Leonard Peltier. It was only a couple years ago, and Mark Trahant can attest to that fact, he's sitting back there, that we had a board of directors meeting in northern Wisconsin, and Mark was there along with other people involved in News from Indian Country and IndianCountryTV.com. And when everyone came into that meeting that day, there was 44 linear boxes of material stacked up against the wall, 120 cassette interviews sitting in a box, a dozen books, a dozen VHS tapes, all kinds of other odds and ends. It was all stacked up against the wall. Because I have never acted independently in this investigation. It was never Paul DeMain's investigation, even though he took on a lot of the legwork, and News from Indian Country took a lot of the legwork on. It was never an investigation called Paul DeMain's investigation. It was about all the material out there. It was about all the people who did interviews over the years. It was about all the files that were compiled. And our goal was to try to accumulate as much as we could. And that was based on a 1994 meeting, I think in South Dakota, of several Native American journalists who wanted to review the cases of Anime Piktuakwash and Leonard Peltier and see what we could find. The last time I made a presentation, the most difficult thing today is that I wrote out a lineup this morning of some of the thoughts. The last time I did a presentation, it was about 3 hours long for a university combine class, and 45 minutes after I was done making my presentation of 3 hours, I was still answering questions by people at the university in Native American history and activism and current affairs and stuff like that. There's a tremendous amount of material here. There's 35 years of documents. There's thousands of stories that were recorded that may be yet recorded, and the history of all this hasn't closed. So in 1994, a group of Native American journalists came together and decided we wanted to review these cases. And really the mentor in the crowd, and I pay all my respects to the late Richard LaCourse, who had investigative capabilities coming out of his experience. And in some cases, they were ruthless. We didn't just hear something and print it. We decided that before we printed anything, because of the nature of the case involving multiple murders that we were looking into, that we would have to have at least 2 attributions to go ahead and publish it, but those attributions had to be distant attributions, 2-party attributions. So for example, if subject A and B were related to each other in a pod, we couldn't print it. We had to have an independent confirmation over here in addition to what was going on over here before we could go to press. And it really, I think, will, in the long run, and would have, under any circumstances that we confronted, served us well as journalists to have done this in this particular case. You want to remember that some 30 or 40 million people at one point had signed petitions to free Leonard Peltier throughout the world. And multiple files and cases and books have been written on the case. And we were fine as long as we were in sync with that. For example, we discovered a lot of things when we talked about the cases of Anna Mae Piktuaqash and Leonard Peltier as separate cases. We came to the fast realization that there was no difference between looking into Leonard Peltier's case and looking into Anna Mae Piktuaqash's case. And there's a lot of reasons, because those people were all in the upper tier level of the American Indian movement in one form or fashion. And so where AIM was, Leonard was, and Anna Mae was, because Leonard Peltier was Dennis Banks's bodyguard, and Anna Mae Piktuaqash was one of Dennis Banks's lovers. And so it was like following the same path. Wherever we found one, we found the other. And that became a clue to what was happening as well. And I want to remind people, I supported Leonard Peltier from a number of reasons. He spent a lot of time in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. He was, one of his other lady friends was Marge Paulus, who's an Oneida, the younger sister of Herb Paulus, very active in the American Indian movement, both of them. And I'm a member of that tribe and related to the Paulus family. So there was a lot of reasons that I was connected to Leonard Peltier, because there was people around me who were advocating for him. And I was interested in it, and my mind was in that vein, that I believed that the FBI was capable of doing certain things that they had been accused of. And in 1994, I thought it would be a good idea to propose this whole thing about looking into these cases, because, of course, if we uncovered the smoking gun, which showed he was framed or was innocent, or we uncovered the real killer, that would look really good. And so we went into it, I think, with a lot of enthusiasm about what we could potentially do to resolve these cases, the so-called mystery and unsolved murder of Anna Mae Piktuaqash and the wrongful incarceration of Leonard Peltier. I no longer support Leonard Peltier in any form or fashion. And it's the realization about what this case has done to me and my profession, both in the business and individually, that brought me to that level where I simply say, I won't have anything to do with it, because I think he's a liar, and until he stands up and helps correct that coarse impression, it's finished. And I can show you little ways that this happened. In 1992, 93, 94, there was a series of resolutions that NAJA passed and the Unity Board of Directors passed. Both those resolutions were introduced by me and presented by me, and very forcibly promoted with me as the president of the Unity Coalition and president of Native American Journalists Association, that said we supported the release of documents, FOIA documents, on behalf of Leonard Peltier. We still have that position. We think there are way too many documents that are held secret, far too long, and too many censors that got to do their job to serve the good of the public. And so we still support that. But if you go to the LPDC site, you will see that those resolutions are now projected as supporting the freedom of Leonard Peltier, but they don't tell you what's behind the documents. Not a great big deception, but enough to put Native American Journalists Association and Unity supposedly in the same category as saying, we support freedom for Leonard Peltier, when we don't until we know what the documents say, until we come to certain conclusions. And so it's those little things that begin to bug me and Richard LaCourse. Richard LaCourse had made up his mind very early that there was situations in this case that deemed looking at. a 1994 grand jury into the case of Anime Piktuakwash, where the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee comes out and says, "Hey everyone, here's a news release. The reason they're having a grand jury on the murder of Anime Piktuakwash is because it's an attempt to keep Leonard Peltier in prison for the rest of his life." And I looked at that and says, boy, if the FBI killed Anime Piktuakwash, how can this be? I haven't heard his name involved in the murder of Anime Piktuakwash at this point in any way, form, or fashion. That's kind of interesting. But I set it off to the side for a long time because I did not think there was a connection. But I often think about that in future years. Through 1994 and 97, me, Richard LaCourse, and Minnie Two Shoes, the late Minnie Two Shoes, who was birthed into the American Indian movement and lived it with every breath until her passing, and she still sustained her support for the movement as a movement of the people with a leadership that had gone corrupt. And so she always reminded me to say, it wasn't the American Indian movement that did this or did that, it was individuals and leaders within the movement, and we had to narrow it up to that because of the sacrifice that thousands and thousands of people made. From 1994 to 97, we seemed to have a real good rapport with Vern Belcourt, Clyde Belcourt, Dennis Banks, as we investigated the documents all over the country. Unfortunately, during that time period, I began receiving death threats, late-night phone calls telling me my life was in danger because I was asking too many questions. I thought, wow, these FBIs are getting scared that we're going to reveal the truth. The only trouble is the people who were calling me up and warning me about it were friends within the American Indian movement. And I thought that was interesting. Because really the launch of the investigation in 1994 had roots in a great gathering in Minneapolis, St. Paul, with Dennis Banks, Clyde and Vern Belcourt, Eddie Benton Benet, who was in prison with the Belcourts, and Dennis Banks when the idea of AIM was formed, George Mitchell, many of the women who were there originally. And during that time, there was people in the crowd like this. There was women that were saying, when is someone going to look into Leonard Peltier's case? You haven't said anything about it for years, you guys. When is someone look into the murder of Anime Piktuakwash? And Vern Belcourt, in the fashion that he always did, kind of got up there and hammered around for a while, and all of a sudden he said, it's his fault right there. He's the president of the Native American Journalists Association. He's an investigative journalist. If we can't get media, if we can't get Indian media to do it, talk to Paul DeMain about this investigation. They should be heading this up. They should be doing it. He's a premier investigation journalist. And why, if they're not going to look into it, why would you expect anyone else? And so I says, well, I've kind of been put in a corner here today in a big crowd. Yes, we'll look into it. So we took it to NAJA. I took it to NAJA because they wanted that. They didn't say they wouldn't like the outcome of it. So we gathered information. We went to the FBI reading room, and I could be up here for 3 hours to tell you about all kinds of experience there. The Wickledock records in Minneapolis, all over the country where there are repositories of information. There's information all over the place in attics and drawers, organizations, records, boxes. Hopefully everyone will send everything that they have to the Sequoia National Research Center in Little Rock, Arkansas someday, where they can compile a real nice archive of that material. But there was many times that I feared for my children because of what was coming in by phone. I got a phone call from the East Coast one time saying someone in Denver, Colorado said I was dead meat because of the questions I was asking. And at some point I realized that even some of my sources of information were being compromised, especially when I talked to one. The next day I happened to run into Vern Belcourt, and within 24 hours that individual was warmed off from talking to me again. I was like 1997, 1998. I says, this is interesting. This is interesting. We now find out that Vern Belcourt is not only consulting with me on a regular basis, but he's calling people up and says, don't be talking to Paul DeMain anymore, after asking me to look into this case. And that told me something about the case. I passed around for your information a letter that I thought was really instructive to some of this. Excuse me, I'm going to bounce back for a minute. My records and files go back to 1973 in Wounded Knee, records that I gathered in 1975 through college. all kinds of information, Akwesasne notes, all the way through 1994 when we started officially choreographing and charting and indexing, and we've created indexes of this information. The 44 boxes are going to go to a public place sometime so people can research it and look at the emails and everything else we got. We got to make sure that sensitive things are taken out of there before we do it, but most of those documents, in fact, over a dozen boxes are at the Lac-Courte Community College already. I got rid of a lot of stuff that I didn't want to look at anymore. During that time period, I made a lot of good relationships with people out there. One of them is sitting on this side. This is Denise Maloney, the daughter of Anime Pictuakwash. And on this side, this is Attorney Barry Bacharach. I made relationships with federal prosecutors. I've talked to judges in the case. I got to know some FBI agents as human beings trying to do their job, and actually listen to the stories of some FBI agents who were assigned to Pine Ridge who said, you know, when you think you're going to be shot and killed next and you got children, you bust down doors and rough people up sometimes because you think that's the best way to make sure that you live one more day. And sitting there talking to people and seeing them feel that shiver and shake from when they worked at Pine Ridge made me realize that some of these guys were scared. They were scared for their lives. And so some of that reaction was very human on both sides within the American Indian movement and within the FBI. And I got to know a lot of defense attorneys. Right now, being a defense attorney in Rapid City, South Dakota is very lucrative because all the AIM leadership people have attorneys, just in case something happens. By going through that, and I'm almost done here, so I want to wind down and give Denise a chance and Barry a chance to say a few things. The one thing I wanted to note was during the course of all this thing, the death threats and the late nights, the fear of the children, the lawsuits, the time being gone, that one of the things we also had to face at News from Indian Country was a lawsuit that was filed against me for defamation and libel, slander, for lying in the public and printing it. And we were able to overcome that. I was never really scared about whether or not we could overcome that, but you have to deal with it. And so on both ends, as an individual that was sued and as an individual that sued, you want to hear the perspective about perhaps what went into that and why and where it ended up. It was settled out of court. I would have liked to have it gone to court myself, because I think we would have prevailed and got a dismissal there. It never went there. So in the long run, it was a good experience. It was a trying experience. It has been a tremendous experience, but it's an experience that I've lived from 1973 when I started gathering these records. And some people who know me, Jim Bettinger, who rides from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Window Rock once a year for a Navajo Times Board of Directors meeting, hears 3 hours on that trip every year about what's going on. I live this, and it's very easy to segue into all the documents and all the information I have in my head, because I get called by defense attorneys and I get called by prosecuting attorneys, and sometimes we get called by the FBI. They say, do you know anything about this? And I says, oh, there's something over here. It's the reason I passed the letter out. It's because Richard LaCourse copied his file, almost his complete file, other than a couple portions of it, and sent it to Detective Abe Alonzo in Denver, Colorado. And as a journalist, you might ask, how did he do that? It's because we had printed a whole series of articles which provided, and all the information that was in those articles came out of these base documents. And Richard concluded that we had an ethical and a moral responsibility as journalists not to hinder an investigation. And that when documents we utilized within our newspaper stories, once we printed those newspaper stories, became part of the public record, or should be put into the public record. And therefore those documents that are put into the public record, whether they're in the library where Abe Alonzo could go get them, or whether he sent a copy to the local library where they're in the public domain and a copy to Abe Alonzo so he could look at them and respond to them, that was fine within the ethics of journalism and journalists. Our protected sources are still protected in some cases, and will remain so until they decide otherwise. I still have at least one protected sources that has not come out of the closet. And that source will remain protected until they decide, which was what I provided to them at the time when I interviewed them. Last year there was an affidavit filed by Cyril Chapman, who was a federal witness, because he had been asked to provide all the information, chapters, notes, books, backdrop information, and everything else going into a book that he was proposed to write called Murder Inside the American Indian Movement. And he was called as a federal witness in a case of Richard Marshall, and was told to turn everything over to a federal court. In that affidavit, I was asked to provide an index of everything that I had that was in the public record. So I created that as part of the affidavit, and it was submitted to federal court and given to the defense attorneys. And basically, my position at that time was that unless I had a protected source, that material was now basically in the public domain for use, because essentially a lot of it is. It's notes and documents that have been reproduced from the FBI reading room, from the Wickeldoc records in Minneapolis, St. Paul, from many, many other places. And so every now and then a defense attorney will call me up and say, do you know anything about this? And I can say there's a public document over here. The FBI has called me and asked me some questions about where they could get material. I says, well, it's over here. It's just documents in that, public documents. There's a YouTube here, there's this, that, there. There are things in the public domain that they can get to. And during that time, so it's out there, it's available. I've never failed to provide information to any of my fellow journalists. In fact, I don't think I've failed to provide information that I've been asked for from anyone at this particular date, including Attorney Barry Bacharach. I found that over the years, one of the relationships I've formed was Arlo Looking Cloud, who talked to me prior to his indictment, arrest, conviction for being party to first-degree murder in 1994. I interviewed him. We printed that interview and printed that information. We printed information regularly about Arlo's participation in the murder of Anna Mae Piktu-Aquash, and that helped send him to jail. It helped send him to prison for life. But I found the things he told me from the very beginning before he was indicted very, very credible. There is fear of the unknown and trust factors. But like Richard Tuoff, who did an interview in Fort Lauderdale almost 10 years ago, I gave him tobacco and says, when you're ready to talk, come talk. And it was a year later that he came and talked. And he said, the reason I did it is because this guy down at the Denver Post wanted to come do an interview the same day he ran into me, and he says, oh, we can win a Pulitzer, and we can do this and do that and everything else, and it'll be on the front page. And Richard says, no, I'm not ready. So it took a year for Richard to come down here and be interviewed by journalists. It's taken Arlo a long time to trust me. As I told him, I says, you know, we printed a lot of stuff that got you sent to prison, but I'm going to make this offer too. I know who was involved in this. I know the leadership people who gave the orders. I know that all the leadership at the top level knew about the orders for the execution of Anna Mae Piktu-Aquash, that they all had motives to move against her. I found the testimony of Kamuk Nichols, who went from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Lacoudere, Wisconsin, to sit down and talk with me, credible. And when she told me that Leonard Peltier confessed to her about shooting the agents, I believed her. We interviewed her sister, and she confirmed independently what Kamuk had said, and we had a third source, so we could go to press. My confidential source that has decided that he does still not want to come out of his confidential status. But because he was a pot out of Denver, Colorado, and Kamuk, Nichols, and Bernie Lafferty are sisters, we could not use the online tape-recorded interviews we had with Bernie and Kamuk until we found a third source. Actually, the third source was my first source. So we were able to use that material, and we went to press, and I went to press saying I believe that part of the reason that Anna Mae Piktu-Aquash was executed was because Peltier had confessed to her, and that he was guilty of shooting the agents he was convicted of. And basically that was the basis for a lawsuit against our newspaper. That's as much as I want to say today. It's been a trying case for me as a journalist, but it tells you that if you pursue a story, you might be working on it 15 years later yet, depending on what it is. And in the openness of saying where I'm at, I need to also let you know, as journalists are out here, that I'm now a member of Arlo Looking Cloud's defense team. Because I went and met with him after he was convicted, and I sat down and says, my writing helped get you convicted. You came to me and you showed remorse way before you were indicted. If there's a case that deserves justice, it's Arlo Looking Cloud's case, because he admitted his role and came forward and has cooperated with federal authorities and not lied, like Leonard Peltier, I believe, continues to do on a daily basis, like Clyde Belcourt does, like Dennis Banks, like Russell Means. The generals still have not taken responsibility for what they had their troops do. And yet there are people at that grassroots level who are trying to tell the truth. And what they are is scared. Because on my list, there's 13 people. And about 35 people that were involved on the peripheral of those 13 murders. And each one of them represents ears and eyes who were worried about, if they say this, they're going to say something about that. So when you look at this case and you hear people say, well, Leonard Peltier is an innocent man, I always look at it and say, who is it and why are they saying that? When Dennis Banks gets up there and says Leonard Peltier is an innocent man, I wonder if Leonard Peltier doesn't know that they killed Ray Robinson in Wounded Knee in 1973, or Jeanette Bissonnette, or Johnny Moore, or some of the other named victims. Some of these people have to say what they say to the media and the public, because Leonard Peltier has something holding over their heads. With that, that's where I want to leave it right at the moment and give a chance. I'd like to introduce at this time Denise Pictou Maloney, the daughter of Anime Pictou Akwash. Thank you. And we'll take questions after everyone's presented.
Thank you. I don't know if I need to move this. Can you hear okay? Okay, that's great. Paul talked about his journey as a journalist with my mom's case, and I'm here to share with you my mother's truth and the journey that we endured over the last 35 years. There wasn't a lot of media interest in talking to our family early on, and as a matter of fact, it wasn't until 15 years ago that journalists like Paul Demain started contacting us and talking to us and asking us our experiences and what happened in my mom's murder case. Our biggest challenges over the last 35 years was getting our story told and getting the truth out there. After 35 years of uncontested lies, people were having difficulty being able to sort through the smoke and mirrors that were created by my mother's murderers. Before then, reports through the media had only contacted members of the American Indian Movement, people that were at Wounded Knee, their supporters. They would contact our family to discuss with us about her early lifehood, but there wasn't a lot of discussion about what our family went through during this turmoil and during her murder and the investigation. My mother's truth did not always create the drama and the conspiracy that sells papers and newspapers and magazines. No one wanted to go against the common flow and take a stand and take the risk that Paul Demain took to keep pushing that envelope in demanding justice for my mother. The sacrifices that many of us have suffered with personal and professional losses, and also relationship losses, business losses, not for myself personally, but with time, this has consumed 15 years of my life actively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a quick little rundown of what our experience was like, beginning with my earliest experience in kind of a quick Reader's Digest format. So there'll be some dates in there, and I'll just ask you to try and follow along, because what you'll see throughout this whole process is you'll see where different events happened, what happened with us during those events. Over the last 15 years, I took it upon myself to contact certain individuals within the American Indian movement. No one in 35 years has ever come to us to talk to us about our mother, other than Paul Demain and a few other journalists after that. The first contact we had, strangely enough, was through Arlo Looking Cloud, who actually called us and confessed to us over the phone 2 years before his murder about the events that took my mother's life. And that was through the efforts of work that Paul Demain had been doing with Richard Tuel. The next contact I had was with John Trudell, Neelock, and Dino Butler. Again, through accident, had come across them at an event, which I'll tell you about later more. And then there were letters from Leonard Peltier, which a lot of people don't know about. He had contacted us early in the investigative process to warn us not to believe what the federal authorities were saying happened to my mother, because as Paul mentioned, it was just another effort to try and maintain his incarceration and to prevent him from ever becoming a free man. And that being said, he says that he knew nothing about my mother's murder. So I don't know how that could have happened, but he denied knowledge and currently supports John Graham, who was recently convicted with the felony murder of my mother, kidnapping, felony murder. Then there was a run-in that I had with Russell Means. Now, I don't know if any of you knew that in 1999 he did a press conference with Ward Churchill and a man named Robert Pictou Branscombe, who I'll introduce to you in a couple of minutes here, and who he was to our family. He did a press conference where they publicly put the information that Paul and other journalists had been working on over the last several years out into the public light, and named names and started talking truthfully in the public about the events of what happened to my mom. Recently, I had to call Russell because I saw some information on the internet where he was supporting a man named Richard Marshall, who was charged with providing the gun that they used to murder my mother. And I had called him up to ask him if he had had a change of heart, because it didn't make sense that he was supporting a man that was involved in my mother's murder when a few short years before he had publicly made a stand on film and said the things that he said to help bring justice and the incarceration of these people. He confessed to me that, or admitted to me that he was upset with the authorities because he had wanted to go to grand jury. He knew who ordered my mother's murder, but that he could not share that information with me because he was bound by a code of secrecy and an oath that he made to that individual that as long as they were living, he would not speak their name. Then more recently, there was a radio show, a blog talk radio show, where Clyde Belcourt, there was an event going on in Pine Ridge with some elder housing and services that were not being looked after properly, and he got on a radio show and talked about the American Indian movement and how it was a collective group, and you know, it went on, and I called in and I said, Clyde, you know, I've never spoken to you, but you're talking about the American Indian movement with the recent trials that had just taken place in December. I wanted to know if you had any information about what happened to my mother, or who could I contact, because all of the paths were leading towards the leadership of the American Indian movement. All of the testimony, they all talked about the leadership and the decisions that were made. There were over 23 witnesses that testified during my mother's trials that testified that they all witnessed every step of the way as my mom was marched off to her death, from the kidnapping on to the event where she actually died. Clyde said he didn't know anything, but that he believes Graham when he says he's innocent. So you can see where our family has gotten a lot of conflict in the discussions and what people are saying, specifically with the American Indian movement and their lack of acknowledgement. They will not address it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our experience and tell you about the journey that we had, and specifically myself, but there is my sister who, because of her profession, cannot be here. She's a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and she's my backbone, but she can't be here because of the conflict. And one of the biggest insults, I guess, for her early on when she decided to become a police officer, it wasn't to solve her mother's murder. It was because of what happened to her. And because of that, she wanted to be able to help other people and not have other people go through an injustice like this. And one of the first things that Graham's attorneys accused us of when they found out that she was an RCMP officer, which is equivalent to your FBI agents, was that she was somehow working the case and coercing the case and twisting the truth, when in fact it was me. I was the one that was the spokesperson. She wasn't in the public. It was me, the housewife, that was saying all of this truth publicly. So that kind of fell flat. But we've always run across different comments over the last 35 years, not necessarily to address the truth, but to address issues that have to do with the peripheral issues that have to do with the main truth, that my mother was murdered. You know, there was a big hoopla about her hands being cut off. That wasn't a concern of ours. My mother didn't die from having her hands cut off. It was the fact that she was murdered. And it's the betrayal that we've had to contend with over the last 35 years that has, I think, the biggest impact on our family and our nation, is that people who my mother sacrificed everything for to go and help with the organization turned on her and then lied about it for 35 years and still continue to lie about it to this day. And when we look around in our communities and we wonder why we have so much suicide, why we have so much poverty and so much corruption, that's still going on. 35 years later, you have people in power that have done things in their past that will not take responsibility for it. These guys are portrayed as heroes, holding longest diabetes walks, having marches in Washington. And yet, over the 35 years, not one of them has ever contacted their professed hero in the past until we came on the scene and asked them not to do that. I publicly demanded that they stop using my mother's name because she became synonymous as their martyr, as their victim by the hands of the government. And in fact, now we know through 3 trials, 1 guilty plea, and 23 witnesses that it was in fact members of the American Indian movement that murdered my mother and not the FBI, as they all have said for the last 35 years. So some of you may know my mother as an advocate for human and women's rights, a defender and protector of Native and civil rights, and a member of the American Indian movement. Most of you may even more commonly know her through her murder. Today I want to share with you our journey so that you can understand and have an opportunity to learn who my mother was as a human being and not as a murder victim, and the journey that our family has endured and the impact that the media has had on this case. My mother was a staunch advocate for Native women and civil rights, and she protested and spoke out against the deplorable living conditions in our communities. She protested against injustices all suffered by our communities in a time when equality and justice was just a promise and words on paper and not a reality for all. She took a stand when it even involved taking a stand against your own people. She saw events and witnessed activities during those times that she did not morally and ethically agree with. There were reports of people drinking and doing drugs before Sundance, the way the men treated the women, slapping them around. My mother had a big problem with that, and she would have gotten in their face about that. And back in those days, That's not something that a 5'2" woman could do openly without having to pay the consequences. The one and only controversy, I'll tell you, that is involved in my mom's murder, because there are a lot of controversies that have been created over the last 35 years in an attempt to try and protect those that were involved in her murder, was the conscious efforts of those who claim to be her friends to hide their betrayal by using the injustices my mother worked so hard to fight against as their excuse and justification for murdering one of their own. This makes a mockery of what my mother lived for and all that she represented and stood for. It is my hope through my mother's murder that some recognize the lessons to be learned in our communities and the wake-up call that we all need to take, where historical injustices seem to become the crutch for allowing injustices to proliferate throughout our communities. The civil and human rights movement is no longer a tool to deal with just the government's injustices, but with injustices within our own communities. There has to come a time when the historical injustices are no longer a noose around our necks, preventing us from moving forward and past a very dark era. There has to be a collective realization that there can be acknowledgement of these injustices and healing and progression without losing our identities, by no longer allowing others to dictate how we are to suffer the effects of those generational oppressions. No longer should we be identifying ourselves as victims, but rather as survivors, by taking measures that the rights promised to us are an expectation and not just words on paper. My mother taught me 3 valuable lessons, and 3 of the last sentences she said to me, the first one she said was, "Don't ever let anyone tell you that they're better than you are. We're all created equal. And whatever you do, don't lie. Always tell the truth." And the most haunting, the last time I saw her, she said, "Look after your sister. You're elder. I'm counting on you to look out for her." And of course, knowing now that was the last time I saw her, I didn't know at that time that would be the last words that she would speak to me. And promised to call us at Christmas time, which never happened. I attribute part of my ability to survive this quest for justice for my mother, for those 3 sentences that she told us. The earliest memory I have of my mother was one of the last Christmases that I spent together as a family. We were about 5 or 6 years old, and my parents separated shortly after that. It was at this time in my mom's life, just after her separation from my father, that she became involved with the Boston Indian Council in Massachusetts. And it was also at the same time that the American Indian movement showed up at the Boston Indian Council looking for new recruits. My mother was drawn to the movement's ideals in making change and protecting the rights of those who could not help themselves, and eagerly signed up. She also recognized the opportunity a national organization such as AIM presented in carrying other ideas out to the masses, such as Tribe, which was a program focusing on education through the revival of Native traditional ways. It was then that she also met Nogishi Gakwash. We traveled everywhere with my mother and attended several protests with her. I was at the Mayflower takeover in Plymouth Rock. We went to Washington, D.C. with her, attended the BIA protests there. Of course, being a child, you don't know what's going on. You think everything is, that was my life. It wasn't, I didn't know it was a protest, other than she did explain to us that we were fighting for our rights, and she was always very honest with us. But there was never any fear or any question as to what, if we were doing the right thing. It was just, that was our life. In February 1973, my mother left us in the care of her sister, and she answered a call by the American Indian Movement to attend what turned out to be the 71-day siege and take over Wounded Knee. During that 71-day siege, she had made several trips back and forth to see us, so we always had contact with her of some sort, bringing supplies back and forth and also checking in on us. And because of those activities, my mother became wanted by the FBI. And there were several warrants out for her arrest following Wounded Knee. So in July of 1973, my father and her had an understanding, an agreement that whoever could look after us best would have custody of us. So knowing that my mother was wanted by the FBI, she agreed that it was probably not the best life to be running on the run with your children. So she agreed to have my father take temporary custody of us, and we moved to Canada with him. Through witness accounts and through the legwork of Paul Domain and News from Indian Country and others, we were able to trace the events and general location of my mother during this time. And I think he has it nicely listed out on NFIC website. But the most important points in those is one of the last visits that my mother had with us. She expressed to her sisters that she was upset because she had been interrogated, that members within the American Indian movement had accused her of being an informant, and she was very upset because they interrogated her. My aunties at the time begged her not to go back. They said, don't go back. Why do you want to go back? But she insisted. She insisted on going back because she believed in the movement. And she kept saying that she had to prove that they were wrong and that she wasn't the person that they thought she was. She made the decision to risk her own life because of her belief in the movement and the work that they were doing. But more importantly, she understood the power that we have, even as victims, in exercising our own rights. She never got that chance. She was adamant that she did not do what they said that she had done. In August of 1975 is when I saw my mother physically the last time. That's when she came to visit us. And this is when this exchange happened with my aunt, and when she told me those last 3 words. And as she was leaving, she promised to call us at Christmas, as she usually did. None of us imagined that it was the last time that we would see her. It was after that exchange that she returned back to South Dakota, where an aunt of mine would receive a phone call for her, and she was very upset, from a payphone. And my aunt at the time could not get to her all the way from Canada, so said, call back with an address so I can wire you some money so you can come home. She never called back. And Christmas of 1975 came and went, and we did not get our phone call from my mother. My parents and family put on a good face for us. And it wasn't too long after the New Year that I noticed phone conversations being conducted behind closed doors, and I was not allowed to ask questions about what was going on. It was in March of 1975 that my father sat us down in a big armchair in our living room and told us the worst news of our lives. He asked if we wanted to attend the funeral, and we both declined. No child wants to go to their parents' funeral. The reports that their sister had died of exposure did not sit right with my aunties. They grew up with her. They know that my mother was raised in the woods. They knew her survival skills. It did not make sense that she would dress so carelessly during a walk, because initial reports said that she had been hit by a car and had died of exposure, or that she was drunk, or it was before they did any kind of screening. I mean, they had no idea. So they made these concerns known, and a man named Bruce Ellison volunteered on behalf of our family to request another independent autopsy. At this point, we started getting a few calls with concerns about what, as soon as they had identified my mom's body, with concerns of what the FBI had been telling my aunties. I was too young to have these discussions, so this is testimony from my aunties. I never regretted not going to my mother's funeral back then, and was even grateful that I didn't go after my aunties shared their story with me of what happened when they went. They were picked up at the airport in a van littered with ammunition and guns, taken out to the area that they were waking her body. They were not permitted to go into the tent where she was being waked to stand next to their sister. They kept getting asked and interrogated what the authorities had said to them, what information had they heard. They felt very, very threatened and started speaking in their Mi'kmaq language to communicate because they didn't feel safe. They left that funeral heartsick and broken, with no more answers than they arrived, but with more suspicions about what happened to their sister. I would also later learn on in adulthood that on my aunt's return from her funeral, they started a writing campaign. And in the 70s, unless you had a law degree and lots of money, unfortunately, writing to another country for help in justice seemed to lag a little bit. So the cards were stacked against them. They're living in another country. Who were they going to go for help? They had limited funds, dealing with the racist attitudes of the time. And when both AIM and the FBI are suspect, who do you go to for help? You go to the authorities? You go to the American Indian Movement? They had their questions. Our family knew from very early on that things were not right. All of these were contributing factors in some way to why my mother's case sat dormant for over 2 decades. But one of the most remarkable moments for me when I was going through research, and one thing that really hit a chord with me, was reading a letter from the Secretary of State of External Affairs in Canada, where they received a report from the authorities in the United States, where after interviewing over 200 individuals who knew my mother or knew of her, not one of them would cooperate with the authorities. Not one. It was about 1980 where I learned the horrific details of my mother's death. I didn't know that her hands were cut off. I didn't know that she had been shot in the back of the head. I had just heard that she had died, and that, you know, my dad was very careful to protect us because of the tragedy and because of what happened and because of our family's suspicions. And I am grateful that he did that. Not having any answers, my family sat in silent mourning for many years and had nothing but our prayers and hopes that someone with the same integrity and morals and ethics my mother possessed would step forward and speak their truth. I learned first time about my mother's death through a book written by Joanna Brand that my sister actually acquired through our high school library. I recall reading about the details of her death and the reports of several AIM members and their claims that they had loved and cared so much for my mother, yet strange, none of them had bothered to call my family to see how they were making out. And I began to feel that something wasn't quite right, and I began asking myself questions like, how can these people say they are fighting against injustices brought on by the oppressors, yet not once did I see, at least by 1980, any efforts made on behalf for my mother's justice. Not wanting to bring my aunties any further pain, I did not address this question but carried it with me for many years and avoided all contact with anyone from AIM, even to the point of leaving a powwow if I saw someone walk by with an AIM patch on their jacket. I began to think that maybe my mother wasn't important enough to matter. She wasn't, after all, Leonard Peltier. She didn't need to defend herself in any way. She was the victim of a violent act, and she was dead, and dead people don't speak. With no answers but more questions, and feeling like there was nothing we could do about my mother's murder, we busied ourselves with trying to live our lives with that void as best as we could, notably making and marking life's milestones and celebrations with the fact that my mother was not there to experience them with us. Most of my family had all but accepted this would be one of the great mysteries we would just have to learn to live with and get past. And we sat back and watched in silent agony as movies, books, magazine articles, websites, all heralding my mother's accolades and accomplishments with the movement, but none of them addressing her murder, and not one seemed concerned that she had been a victim of a violent crime, other than to point fingers at the FBI. Her name became synonymous with AIM and Leonard Peltier in his efforts to regain his freedom. She attained martyr status in her death through their efforts to bring attention to their own cause by profiling her murder on their websites and at their conventions. Yet no one made efforts to contact the family or aid us in any way to seek justice. My mother's murder became an opportunity to highlight their own injustices and agendas. For many years, they used her image and injustice uncontested while we sat on the sidelines hoping and praying that someone would step forward to speak her truth. In 1997, our prayers were answered. We received a phone call from an auntie living in Indian Brook, Nova Scotia, who said that there was a gentleman that wrote an article in a local newspaper about my mom and that he was trying to contact us. My sister called and said that she had spoken to an aunt, or this gentleman, and that he was a first cousin. His mom and my mom were first cousins, so that would make him, I guess, second cousins. And that he was from the United States, and that he had been traveling throughout the the Southwest and had come across my mother's name, but it was listed as Anamea Quash. His name is Robert Pictou Branscombe. So there wasn't a familial connection until he saw the Pictou in there. And he, at the same time, he began investigating. He became affiliated with Paul Demain from News from Indian Country, as you know, who's been working on the case since 1994. So Robert explained to us that there had been 2 grand juries and that the case had been reopened. And it was through the investigative efforts of men like Paul Demain and Robert that we were able to connect the dots. Because up until that point, we just had all of these experiences, but there was no evidence, no proof. So we could line up for us all of these events as they happened, and the questions seemed to gel for us. At the same time, Paul spoke earlier about the fear. My sister and I had just had our daughters and felt very vulnerable and nervous about stepping forward and demanding justice publicly. My sister, being a member, as I mentioned before, of the RCMP, was limited in her involvement, and so I was thrust to become the family spokesperson. With no preparation or background information, I'm not a public speaker. Other than my mother was the victim of a violent crime was the only thing that I had to go on. If individuals that did not have the right to make those decisions made that decision and decided that my mother did not have the right to live. In 1999, as I mentioned earlier, along with Ward Churchill, Robert Pictou Branscombe, and Russell Means had a conference in Denver, Colorado, where they exposed the information publicly. It was at this time that I received my first letter from Leonard, again, warning us not to believe what the authorities were saying, and that they were only helping us now because they wanted to use us as their pawns in their attempts to keep him in prison and to bring down the American Indian movement. I sent him back a response saying that if he was so convinced that the feds were involved, then he must have proof and would have no problem in assisting us in bringing justice for my mother and helping us in sorting out this information regarding the 3 individuals suspected of murdering my mother, who was John Graham, Arlo Looking Cloud, and Theda Nelson Clark. I did not hear back from him until 2004. 2001, I was in regular contact with Robert Pictou Branscombe and Paul Demain, and I was also working on 2 projects called The Spirit of Anime, which is a film made by filmmaker Catherine Martin through the National Film Board of Canada, and a CBC Fifth Estate documentary that they made called Silence, the Execution of Anime, where they interviewed a lot of the people that were involved and also were witnesses to what had happened to my mom over those years. Her captors and murderers had over 20 years to do damage control and create all sorts of conspiracies, smoke and mirrors, and half-truths to keep the truth hidden. I began publicly denouncing the appropriation of my mother by AIM and the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee and their supporters, claiming that it was incredibly disrespectful to hold honorings and events in my mother's name and not once call the family to at least tell them of it, or if you weren't going to, invite them. I received a phone call in April 2002 from Paul Demain, where he shared with us that he had been in contact with Richard Tuelk and Arlo Looking Cloud was wanting to have a discussion with us. And we agreed apprehensively, but at the same time we're eager to hear, because this would be the first time that we've talked to somebody who directly was with my mom in the last hours of her life. And he confessed that he went through the whole scenario where they picked her up in Denver, Colorado, drove her to Rapid City, to Rosebud, and then out to Wambly, where he said to me on the phone that he watched as John Graham shot my mother in the back of the head and then dumped her body over the cliff. We, of course, left that phone conversation dazed with what we had just heard, because it was the first time we had heard such details about my mother's death. Everything up to that point had been speculation and through second and third witness accounts, but this is a direct first witness account. In late April 2002, we were asked to attend a ceremony for an award ceremony in San Francisco, in my mother's name being held for Neelak Butler, who was married to Dino Butler. And if you don't know who Dino Butler is, he was co-accused with Leonard Peltier and Rob Robidoux during the shootout, the Oglala shootout. Neelak was dying of cancer, so they were going to give her an award in my mom's name for all of her work and her activities and activism. When we arrived, they were having a healing circle, and just as we were getting ready to go and do that, John Trudell walked into the room and became part of the circle. We're holding hands. I was holding my auntie's hand on this side, and I was holding Dino Butler's hand on this side. And the woman that was officiating asked at the end of the ceremony if there was anything else that anybody else wanted to ask for, that this would be the time while we were here to ask for healing or to have questions or comments. And my aunt stood up in her full 5-foot height and said in her voice, nice and loud and clear, "Yeah, I want to know what happened to my sister." Immediately, John Trudell dropped his hands and ran out of the room, broke the circle and left the room, came back into the room, turned around, went back out of the room. I was holding Dino's hand and his hand was shaking. I turned to him and I looked at him and I said, "Is this true? Are these 3 people that they're saying involved in my mother's murder members of the American Indian Movement involved in her murder?" And he started to cry. At that time, Neelock had gone out of the room, came back into the room, grabbed Dino and pulled him into the room. They came back in one more time, grabbed my aunt and took her back and had a private conference where they confessed, yes, indeed, that these 3 people were involved in my mom's murder. So this was the first defining event for me where I was exposed to the lies and the betrayal. It wasn't the fact that I didn't believe that they were involved in her death. It was the fact that people were working consciously to keep that truth hidden. In the second letter from Leonard that we received, before he had denied having interrogated my mother. In the second letter, he admits that he interrogated her, but not at gunpoint, because at that point he knows that that's public information. When I returned from San Francisco after witnessing that bizarre event, I thought, who else was lying? So I took it upon myself to call Robert Roberdeau. And Robert, being there when Leonard had interrogated my mother and put a loaded gun in her mouth and accused her of being an FBI agent or informant, he confirmed that with me and said, yes, he did interrogate her at gunpoint. In his letter, Leonard said that he would not participate in incarcerating another Indian man. And that was the last I had heard from him. Over the last 7 years, I had regular contact with Rob Robidoux, contact with Paul. Of course, we were at the trial stage, indictments had been made. We were in the trial process, so I was not able to comment publicly about the events that were going on. Not that I was always privy to all the information, because a lot of that is closed, and they make sure that nobody knows the details of the investigation for obvious reasons. Took 4 years to extradite Graham once he was arrested from Canada. And as you know, in December 2010, John Graham was found guilty of aiding and abetting felony murder. 3 trials, 1 guilty plea, and the sworn testimony of over 23 witnesses has finally brought justice to our family. And my mother, the efforts, journalist Paul Demain, and other journalists, as he said, collectively gathering the information and exposing the truth. Individuals like Kamuk Akafi, Cyril Chapman, who got called informant because they dared to speak the truth. They had the nerve to expose the information they knew about my mother's murderers. Our journey is not over. Someone made that call to initiate the events that would lead to my mother's death. Questions have to be asked of current leadership of AIM and Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, why nothing was done about exiling these individuals from their group. As a matter of fact, they embrace them now, and they openly and publicly support John Graham. Why are they so adamant at protecting the integrity and sanctity of their professed brotherhood with criminals and murderers? Is a woman's life, one of their own, not as valuable as the brotherhood? Why does the action of Leonard Peltier's interrogation of my mother at gunpoint and his refusal to help the daughters of my mother of a heinous crime continuously get ignored, not to mention the fact that he is currently supporting Graham? AIM's refusal to address my mother's murder will not go unnoticed, and there should be a public outcry from those members who I know have pure hearts and are doing good things for our people. My mother was one of those people. My mother is not a dirty secret, and until this is done, my mother's murder will continue to haunt the leadership of AIM. In the last 36 hours of my mother's life, she suffered indignities no human being should ever suffer. At the hands of Rome people who lied, conspired, and pointed fingers, all at the very institution she spent her short life protesting for the injustices brought upon our own nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I'd like to, at this point, introduce, try to get moving right along. I know we're at the end of the hour. We're going to go a little bit longer because we started a little bit later. But I'd like to introduce someone that I consider to be a friend and who is a colleague of mine now, Attorney Barry Bachrach, who represents Arlo Looking Cloud. Thank you.
I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank Denise and Paul for letting me share time with them. I'm very humbled to be here to speak about such an important event and events. I'm an attorney and I currently represent Arlo Looking Cloud. I've represented Arlo for approximately 3.5 years, since February of 2008. Rather than me attempt to describe Arlo or talk to you about him and his personality, I'm going to, at the end, read some words from him that can best describe where he is at now. And I want to now go back in time and let you know how I came from, at one point, representing Leonard Peltier to where I am today, representing Arlo Looking Cloud and seeking justice for Annie Mae Aquash. Back in about late 2001, early 2002, I became an attorney for Peltier, and primarily looking for the search for Freedom of Information documents. At that point in time, we had been given about 32,000 documents. There were many other documents out there, and I, along with a fellow named Mike Kuzma, searched through all the field offices to get more documents, and it turned out there were another 130,000 documents. But let's put that issue aside. The bottom line is, at that time in my life, I was a neophyte, a baby. I knew of Native struggles, but I didn't know much about Peltier's case. I didn't know much about the American Indian movement other than what I'd read on Wounded Knee and what I'd read in Matheson's book and in some other books. And so while I was worked with Leonard and the Defense Committee, I was involved with many people, and of course there was a lot of rhetoric that I didn't have the capability to filter at that point in time. Of course, if you didn't agree with someone, you were a Fed. If you did this, you were a Fed. And of course, this person's a Fed, that person's a Fed. There was a lot of paranoia and blame on the federal government. And that's sort of the mentality that pervaded working with the Defense Committee during that time period. Now, in about 2003 was when the indictments came down relative to Arlo Looking Cloud and John Graham. And from that point forward, the landscape for Leonard's release, in my opinion, changed significantly. Prior to that time, he of course had sought clemency from President Clinton, which was denied. He had then resurrected in attempts after President Clinton to work and rejuvenate. But now, when people were indicted for the murder of Annie Mae Aquash, Leonard's name started coming up in newspapers, in accounts. And at that point in time, again, I'm learning things, but I don't know a lot. And at this point in time, in 2003, I'm buying into the story that had been told that the FBI had her murdered. The FBI murdered her and covered it up, putting aside the issue of whether or not there was any involvement by the FBI. Leave that for another day. There are some issues, but at that point, the entire rhetoric and it was being spun as that don't pay attention to what is happening. These guys are innocent. We did nothing wrong. Look at what the FBI did. They cut off her hands. They covered it up. And so that became the rhetoric of 2003. But as Leonard's name became more and more involved in the situation, I realized that his biggest challenge for freedom for him was, as I viewed it at that time, was clearing his name and making sure that he could get to the public that he didn't have any involvement, which meant to me I had to learn as much as I could about this matter so that I could assist him in fighting the shadows, because at this point in time, he was being accused of many things. There were but we didn't know who was making the accusations. We didn't know what was occurring, who was saying what. There was a lot of accusations about Leonard having given an order. In fact, on Amazon.com, when Dennis Banks' book came out, there was a book review right next to Dennis's book on Amazon, which indicated that Leonard gave the order. Now, Dennis, in his book, ignores the whole issue of the murder and never even mentions that. So I called Dennis and asked him, why is this in a book review when it has nothing to do with your book? In any event, the bottom line to me was that Leonard was going to be seeking parole, that putting aside the issue of the killing of the two agents and what occurred at that time, the murder of Annie Mae Aquash would be the last nail in his coffin, because if he was implicated in that, he already had 2 life sentences, and it certainly was going to be the death knell for his name to be involved. So at that point in time, I viewed that representing Leonard, it was important to me to learn as much of the case so that I could help fight the shadows, that I could put some substance to comments, and rather than just use the age-old rhetoric that had no substance. Well, what I've learned in the 8 years of my reviewing hundreds of thousands of documents, speaking with numerous people, has left me saddened and changed my perspective on a lot of things. And I'll get to that as we evolve into it. I'll be very brief because I know I don't want to cut into anyone's lunch, but let me so quickly move along. Well, this leads to the issue of what Paul mentioned with respect to the lawsuit. In or about early 2003, in an editorial in News from Indian Country, Paul wrote, I have right here the quote, "The primary motive for the murder of Annie Mae Pictou-Aquash by the members of AIM was in mid-December, alleging that her knowledge that Leonard Peltier had shot the two agents and that he was convicted." Now, sorry, I thought I dropped the computer, but I dropped paper instead, sorry. So Paul printed that. There were no names in the article. Of course, he was protecting the names of the people who gave him the information. They weren't ready to come forward. It wasn't the time for them to come forward. But as part of what I saw as my responsibility to zealously represent Peltier was that we could no longer allow people to make accusations without putting the names to it and without revealing the sources and providing solid evidence. So on May 1st, 2003, I, on behalf of Peltier, filed a lawsuit against Paul in federal court in Minnesota, alleging defamation, libel, that in fact Peltier hadn't admitted shooting the agents, that that the motive for killing Annie Mae Aquash didn't involve Peltier, and that lawsuit moved forward. But again, the reason why that lawsuit was brought was as part of my defense plan and others at that time to try to put faces to the shadows who were making accusations. Now, there's an interesting side note to this that very few people know, but while that lawsuit was pending, because we finally settled it in 2004, I'm convinced that the reason it settled is that Paul couldn't reveal who had made these statements yet. And certainly, as it was leading up to the trial of Arlo Looking Cloud in 2004, he couldn't compromise these people or compromise their health and safety as to what they said. Putting aside the issue for now, whether or not what they said is true, I can't comment because of my former representations of Peltier, but the bottom line is, from Paul's perspective, he had to protect his sources. And the other irony is that I primarily defended the press and libel suits, and this is one of my first suits where I was on the other side. That's just a side note. I had spent, actually, Gannett was a client of ours that I had spent many times representing in defamation suits. But one of the interesting things, as I'm looking into this case, Arlo Looking Cloud was going to trial on a Tuesday, I think it was in February of 2004. And I remember this very distinctly because my wife and I were driving into Boston to go to a concert. I can't remember who the concert was, but we were driving in and I got a call on my cell phone. And it was Bruce Ellison. And I said, Bruce, what's going on? And Bruce says to me, hey, Kamuk Nichols is going to testify at Arlo's trial that Leonard admitted shooting the two agents. And of course, I'm in disbelief that Kamuk or anyone would say this. So I talked to Bruce for a bit, and thereafter tried to get a hold of Attorney Wrench to no avail. And sure enough, Kamuk testified, as she has consistently said, that Leonard admitted shooting the two agents while they were traveling in the Brando motorhome. And that led to, and the conviction of Arlo Looking Cloud led to me continuing even harder to find out what really happened here, what occurred. Again, not willing to believe what was being said about Peltier, I fought even harder to find out everything I could about this, getting Freedom of Information documents, as many as I could. Steve Hendricks wrote a book and shared his documents with me. I got documents from others. I spoke to virtually all the major players, and actually, though I wasn't officially representing Looking Cloud, Vernon Bellecourt in 2004 approached me and asked me to help Terry Gilbert, and I actually wrote part of Arlo's appellate brief and was working with Terry Gilbert, I had spoken to Looking Cloud Arlo at one point, and I remember I was at a wellness check for my 5-year-old, and Arlo called, and my wife was none too happy that I took the call, but I'm talking to Arlo. But Arlo had a distrust for me at that point, which I later learned was mainly because I was representing Leonard and had a lot of contacts with AIM leadership. And Arlo really didn't want to follow up with me. He had a few conversations at that point in time, and that was about it. But I always was interested that the fact that Vernon would call me regularly when he wanted something, and was calling me regularly to help represent Arlo, and then in connection with Graham, apparently he didn't realize I was representing Arlo. He wanted me to help represent Graham, which I wouldn't have done anyway, let alone the fact that I had a conflict representing Arlo. But it always sort of intrigued me how much Vernon was trying to control the defenses in this matter. But putting that aside, we did settle the matter with Paul. Paul made a vanilla statement. It actually settled. Bob Robidoux was on a conference call, and I think I was on the call with you and Bob, and Paul made a rather vanilla statement, did not recant what he had been told by the witnesses, but merely made statements which I believe he agreed with today that Peltier didn't get a fair trial. That's what got me involved in Peltier's case, is reading what occurred, even the court decisions. The trial was unfair, and being an attorney, one of the sacred things is that you have to receive a fair trial. In any event, we settled the matter with Paul, and things just progressed from there. I spoke to people in Denver. I spoke a lot with Bob Robideau, who actually had a lot of information and had been investigating this. I spoke to people in Denver, as I said. I spoke to people directly, allegedly involved, and by in or about 2006, what I saw in the rearview mirror was a totally different story or facts than what I had been led to believe and what I thought was the case. It really disheartened me as I learned more. I had come into this thinking very highly of the AIM leadership. I still think very highly of what AIM should have stood for, and what many of the grassroots and the people who really work for AIM and what it stands for. But I was left very disgusted with what I learned about the leadership and what I learned about what occurred in this matter and those on the periphery of the leadership. I also, through Paul, had the pleasure of, in or about, I think it was 2006, 2007, speaking with Jean Moore. I never met Jean, but I did speak to her on the phone several times. Always an upbeat woman, obviously had a number of health issues, but always upbeat. She was, her son, Johnny Moore, as Paul mentioned, was murdered in the non-leadership trials in Lincoln, Nebraska. Jean had been able to get about 60 documents through FOIA requests many years earlier. I renewed FOIA requests and ended up getting, I think, about 300 documents, which I shared with her, but she already knew what occurred, and she knew what happened. And for me, it was more of an enlightenment to me as to the thuggery of a number of AIM members, and even the philosophies of some of their attorneys who were involved. So by about 2006, I had become very disillusioned. Again, not with Native struggles, but with the AIM leadership, which I think turned more to sex, money, and drugs than they did cared for their people. And I would tell that to their face if they were here. In any event, by early 2007, I resigned from the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee. I had once worked for a large firm, about 65 or 70. They were not too enthralled with my work for Leonard, and ironically, there was a parting of the ways because I'd worked for Leonard and several other causes that they weren't particularly fond of, so I parted ways. started my own law firm in January of '07 and realized that I just didn't have the time to work for Leonard. And I left his organization about April of 2007. I continued to stay in contact with Bob Robideau. I continued to look into this, the Anna Mae Aquash murder, because I really wanted to find out as much as I could, and I continue to find out and continue to find out things today. That said, it was I continued to get phone calls. I always gotten phone calls from Arlo's family, because apparently the attorneys he had, Wrench, Gilbert, and the subsequent attorney, never communicated with Arlo and never returned the family's calls. And even though I didn't represent him, they were calling me. They'd call me regularly, and I returned everyone's phone call. And in or about late 2007, early 2008, the family approached Arlo and they asked me if I would help him. And again, I had just started my own firm. I knew this would be pro bono work, but I was very interested in the matter. I had always felt that Arlo, it is hard, you can't say that, you just can't say that someone didn't do anything. I always felt that Arlo was sort of a patsy for the leadership and many other people. I mean, there's at least 20 to 30 names you could rattle off who were involved in this, and more significantly involved than Arlo. And so I knew he had been convicted. I knew he had a habeas corpus pending. I knew he had not gotten good legal counsel. So I was interested to see how I could help him. And now that I had left Peltier, Arlo was willing to talk to me. And I went down to Pollock, Louisiana in February 2008. And I met with Arlo. And Arlo immediately, well, not immediately, it takes some time after I saw him for 2 days, told me what occurred, and actually started giving me some new information that he had been afraid to tell before because of fear that these people would cause retribution or harm him or his family. And so I talked to Arlo, and it was real clear to me that particularly with the new information, that Arlo would be best served by cooperating. That's where his mindset was, and I didn't dissuade him from it. I didn't try to say, no, you got to push it this way or that way. In any event, I met with him then. I met again a couple more times down in Louisiana with him, and then we approached the then U.S. Attorney Marty Jackley, who couldn't make any promises, but listened to Arlo, and based on that information, Dickie Marshall was indicted and tried. The result was not what it probably should have been, but as people know the legal system, you never know what's going to happen. Being an attorney, I know that. In any event, Arlo opened up and he wanted to do this. But Arlo, I have to say, through the years had built up many defense mechanisms. Imagine yourself being a 21-year-old going out looking for, he got involved in this instead of going to his son's first birthday with his then fiance. His son's birthday was November 29th of 75. He chooses to stay at home for a drinking over Thanksgiving and goes to Troy and Lynn's apartment looking for one of his drinking buddies who isn't there, and gets, I can say commandeered into a trip that turned out to be personal hell for him, and obviously should be a personal hell for many others, that led to the murder of Annie Mae Aquash. In any event, Arlo, over the years, had built up, it was like an onion, many layers of defense. And he would tell the facts as if he was as if he was out here looking at it, and never accepted any responsibility. Well, as we all know now, John Graham's been convicted, despite a lot of promises in his defense that he would show A, B, C, and D. He showed nothing and didn't get up to say what, to support any of his claims. And that's on appeal, but he's been convicted. As Dickie Marshall was acquitted, we'll leave that alone. Thelma Rios was convicted based on a plea. And so now Arlo is still in prison. It's been tough for him the past 3 years. Any of us know the code of you don't want to be a snitch or a rat. He lives in constant fear for his life. I have intervened many times over the past couple of years to make sure and try to keep him safe, because I believe his safety is of utmost importance. And the problem is he is considered a snitch or a rat, but I don't think he is. I'm not a big fan of so-called tattletales, and I grew up, you don't tattletale, you don't do, but I think what I'm going to read you from Arlo's heart explains why he should be commended for not what occurred 35 years ago. No one can be commended for that. But I think he should be commended for what he's done now, putting his life on the line, as he should, because he didn't 35 years ago. He had opportunities, and he'll tell you, he had opportunities to help Annie Mae Aquash. He could have manned up and done something to save her. He didn't, and he regrets it. So let me close with some words from Arlo that he's wrote to me in his own language, in English, in his own handwriting. I unfortunately don't understand Lakota, and so he didn't write it to me in that. I, Arlo Looking-Cloud, sincerely apologize to the family of Annie Mae Aquash. I would like to I want them to know that an apology does not begin to make what happened right. I am aware that many people have been impacted by this case, especially Anna Mae's children. I want them to heal. The events of those days haunt me and have since this happened. I feel responsible and take full responsibility for my role. I wish I could go back in time and change things. Wish I had done something. So many things different. The best I can do to bring justice is to cooperate with authorities and make sure all responsible parties are brought to justice. In this case, I think those words are so important. It's time for everyone to step up and tell the truth instead of hiding it. Arlo has stepped up and told the truth, and he knows that apologizing doesn't help. There's nothing, no apology can make Denise or her sister or her family feel better. The only thing, and I'm not even sure that will necessarily make them feel better, but the only possible thing is to get justice for their mother and have the people who were involved brought to justice. And if the people who are involved won't tell the truth, then I hope everyone else does. Thank you very much.
We're running a little bit late, I think, on this, but I don't see anyone waving us out of the room. So if people have a few questions of anyone on this panel, now would be the time to do that, and then we'll get out of here in about 5 to 10 minutes or so, or 10 or 15, whatever. Maybe we'll stay here until they chase us out of here. But go ahead. Is there people with any questions? Direct them to any of the individuals up here. Antoinette?
Just for Denise, I was wondering about the coverage between Canada and the United States.
Coverage in the media? Yeah, there wasn't a lot of coverage. Specifically with Canadian authorities, this was an American issue. So Canadian, there was some CBC coverage. Like I said, CTV, which is our like your ABC, did do a documentary. Fifth Estate with CBC did a documentary. Radio stations did a couple of stories, but more so with the trials, as in the beginning with Arlo's trial in 2004. Any other questions?
Questions? Pretty thorough today, I guess. No lingering anythings? Everyone must be tremendously hungry. One more question over here.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Was it true that the authorities cut her hands off for identification purposes?
Yes. Yes, yeah. At the time, when they found her body, it was so badly decomposed that they could not cut the fingertips off, which is what they normally do. They would cut the fingertips off. It started thawing, so it's kind of a gruesome explanation. But the field agent that actually did that was inexperienced, didn't know what to do, cut the hands off, and then sent them away for identification. Normally, they would cut the tips off and put them in a glove, and then send them away. It wasn't a normal practice, but it was done in special cases. And that's why her hands were cut off. Paul was good.
And I would say that at the time it was much more normal. Dr. Gary Peterson, who actually did the second autopsy, in his latest testimony says it was done a lot more than people realized in that time period. We've come to accept the fact that they don't have to do it, but he said back in that time frame, that was not uncommon amongst a small group of hardship cases. And what he's saying, that was a situation that was of that nature. Either Dennis Banks or John Trudell could have prevented that from happening, because if you look at the trial of Dino Butler and look at the transcript, you'll see John Trudell, who says, basically, Dennis Banks called me on February 26th or 27th, 1976, and told me that they had found the body of Anna Mae and that she'd been shot in the back of the head. That was pretty revealing because Mathiasen actually put it into his book, and you can find it there. But Bill Kunstler, who was at the table at that time, there was someone who asked another question that followed up on it, and he got off of that. But if you go back and look at that, that was within 48 hours of her body being found. She was not exhumed the second time until March 10th, March 6th, and the FBI didn't identify the fingerprints from the hands that they sent to the Washington, D.C. lab until around March 10th or 13th. I don't have my timeline in front of me. But here, Trudell is saying, Banks called me on February 26th and told me they found the body of Anna Mae and she'd been shot in the back of the head. Remember the sequence of things. They didn't identify her until then. She was exhumated, and then they found the bullet in the back of their head. Kamuk Nichols as well testified that she was in Seattle, and Dennis called her from Lee Brightman's house in California and said they found Anna Mae's body. And she remembers it distinctly because it was her nephew's birthday on February 27th, 1976. So both of those individuals were talking about the fact that they had found Anna Mae Piktuakwash, and in Trudell's case, said that Dennis said she had been shot in the back of the head 2 weeks before they even knew who she was. Questions? Marla.
So, in trying to find out who made the phone call, who actually ordered Anna Mae's execution, what's happening with that, and what can the Native American Journalists Association do for journalists?
Well, this is the kind of thing that boxes people in. When we went to Denver press conference and Russell Means said, Vern Belcourt in Minneapolis, St. Paul, called his brother at my brother's house, Bill Means' house on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and ordered the execution of Anna Mae Piktuakwash when they had brought her there in the sequence of events. She was brought there, which is interesting because they says they brought Anna Mae to Bill Means' house, but Vern called from Minneapolis to call his brother Clyde to give the order. Well, how did he know that? Vernon, in his style of things, demanded a meeting with the Native American Journalists Association, where our office was in Minneapolis at that time, and he came down about 2 or 3 weeks after that, and we talked about that, and Vernon says, I have a plane flight check stub that says I was in California at that time when Russell Means said I was in Minneapolis and called my brother. I have the stub there, which was good because it confirmed what I had in my documentation, that Vernon Belcourt was with Lee Brightman and Dennis Banks. Vern was at Lee Brightman's in California with Dennis Banks at that time period, which makes sense. Now you got Banks and Vern Belcourt. Vern Belcourt's job was to weed out informants. He'll tell you that. It was my job to find the pigs and expose them. That's what he did. That's why he did what he did with Anna Mae, which was to expose her and tell people, I think she's a pig. He had her interrogated in Farmington, New Mexico by Leonard Peltier, who put a gun in her mouth and said, if I find out you're a pig, I'll kill you, after taking her out, which Peltier denied first. Then he admitted it, but he said he didn't put the gun in her mouth. But Iris Thundercloud, one of many Two Shoes sources of information, said, who was with Anna Mae at the time, says, Anna Mae came back and says, Leonard put a loaded gun in my mouth and said he would kill me if found out I was an informant. Where was I? How did I segue into that?
What Naja can do about
What Naja can do.
about
So
the phone call.
the question about the phone call, we asked Vernon comes down. Vernon comes down and says, look, if there is a record of me making a phone call to Bill Means' house, it's because I called him every day on AIM Business several times a day. From Minneapolis and from California, wherever I happened to be, I did it on a regular basis. Okay, so first of all, we got the conflict of him saying he was in California. How did Russell know he was in Minneapolis and gave a phone call to Bill Means? And we went to Bill Means, who at OIC in Minneapolis, and says, Bill, what do you say about this accusation that Vernon called you from Minneapolis and ordered Anna Mae's execution? And Bill Means says, well, I distinctly remember that I didn't have a phone. Some people ran up the phone bill to $1,000 and it was disconnected for about 3 or 4 months around that time period. So you got Russell saying this, You got Vernon saying that can't be possible, and you're saying Bill Mings says I didn't even have a phone. Those are the kinds of things that flags up all over the place, because you started talking to people and everyone had their interesting situation and alibi or whatever it is, and nothing's consistent. It's really what led Richard LaCourse to say, I don't believe Peltier anymore. If you look at it, here's a story here, here's another story, here's another angle, here's a different angle. You know, it's like when the agents were shot, I was in Taco Bell. Well, Taco Bell didn't exist at that time. I meant Hardee's across the street. You know, well, Hardee's was closed at that time. Well, I was actually in JCPenney's shopping for sneakers at that time. I distinctly remember I was saving the children down there at JCPenney's. All of a sudden you begin saying, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right, because there's all kinds of edges to what's going on, and it don't work. And that's the smoke and mirrors and trapdoors. We have a puzzle, and I talked with Richard LaCourse about it. We have a puzzle that's got to put together. It's got 1,000 pieces to put it together. The only trouble is there's 1,250 pieces. So you got to weed out the alibis and the smoke and mirrors and say, that's a lie. All right, that's a little bit better. This one fits there. And little by little, you paint this picture that gives you a much better position. What can you do? Continue to ask questions. Every time a journalist asked any of these people in the American Indian movement to explain something, it's good to get it on record, because that's what we looked at. We looked at all the documents. We looked at the FBI documents. They got piles and piles of documents. What do they have? Here's a newspaper article from Akwesasne Notes. Here's the Shoban News. Here's this document. They go out and gather all this intelligence up, you know, and actually censor some of that stuff. Oh, here's a newspaper article, here's the report on it, and they said in the newspaper, we better censor that kind of stuff. And it's phenomenal what they do to prevent people from getting information that's already public. And then the FBI calls up and says, have you ever heard of this? And I says, well, there's a document over here, document number 746. It's your own file. Why don't you look at it, you know, and find it? They rely on people, human intelligence. There's never been a homicide case ever solved with human intelligence, and they deal with every individual that they deal with, whether it's your grandma. Where's Paul DeMaine? Oh, he's in Florida. Well, I met with this informant on this day, because they deal with everyone as people who give information. That's part of their job. So everybody's an informant on the FBI side. It's very easy to say, look at this pig, look at that snitch, this informant, there's a document. They're all pigs. My grandmother's a pig, you know, because she was worried about so-and-so running around with guns and ammunition during that time period. We're concerned about it. Continue to ask questions, continue to challenge, but get into questioning these things that are just blanket statements. Vern Belcourt was a great loss to the cover-up. When he talked with Cyril Chapman, and Cyril Chapman recorded him. Cyril Chapman has a story too. He was not used at the John Graham trial, but Cyril Chapman has a story to tell about the sort of entrapment of him into the federal system as an author and writer. He did a lot of interviews, and the FBI says, we're going to come get them with a subpoena. And so he decided to start cooperating, and once he started cooperating and giving information to the FBI, he was eventually asked to do a wire, which he did. Vern says, my job was to protect the American Indian movement and my little brother, and I did it real well. When the Peltier situation occurred, when the agents were shot, I says, you know what we got to do? We just make white into black. Peltier's an innocent man who's being framed by the FBI, and everybody believed us. Wow, because Vernon started whispering around about Leonard. Well, you know, he admitted to these people that he confessed to these people about shooting the agents, you know, and you really look, there's a motive there, you know, and kind of a thing and all this stuff. I think in Vern's mind, he was already framing Leonard to be the person who gave the order because it made sense. He shot the agents, he confessed to Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash, therefore he had a motive to take her out if they thought she was an FBI agent. So I think he was just saving his ass like he always did. And Peltier was becoming the sacrificial lamb behind the public view of things. Well, you know, kind of a thing, which he did very well. you know, you'd say, and he said things like this. Well, you know, it's like, who's the FBI talking about being at Bill Means' house? Well, now we know there's Charlie Aberesk there, Bill Means, Dolly Means, but Vernon is going, of course, yes, you know, Dolly Means was there, you know, David Hill, yeah. And then silence. And it's interesting because Cyril Chapman did not mention Clyde Belcourt, who we had always been told was at Bill Means' house when the so-called order or decision came down. And Vernon, in the way he needs attention, says, well, and of course my brother was there on the wiretap. But he would never admit that to the press. So, keep asking questions like you always have. It's real good. There's a quick question over here.
I understand that the overarching goal of all three of you would be to get to the truth. I'm curious about the specific goals of, not you so much, Paul, but the other two persons there. Is this to discredit the FBI, discredit Leonard Peltier, correct the history? I mean, where are you trying to get to? This is a lot of...
You're asking them too?
Yes. I'm curious.
Well, for me, it's always been about exposing my mother's story and the truth, and discredit or bringing attention to the different organizations that were involved is part of the truth when it comes to speaking the truth. It's not my intent to discredit them. I'm speaking the truth. So whether somebody thinks that is a discredit, I guess, is their...
Would that be justice for you?
It's not about justice. What happened to my mother happens every day in our communities. People see this. That silence, that code of silence and the protection of the brotherhood, women suffer viciously in our communities because of that. And I have a big problem with people putting that under the rug and turning a blind eye to it in our community. And then you look at why our children are killing themselves and why people have problems with stepping up and speaking their truth without feeling that fear of being retaliated against. And if that people want to, and it's funny you say that because that's probably one of the biggest bones of contention that I have that came out of the American Indian movement towards me when we first started this journey, was that they accused me of being vindictive and vicious and trying to retaliate and even the score. My mother's dead. There's no evening of any score.
Well, as I indicated, my goal for probably 2003 to about 2006 or 2007 was to put light on the shadows. In other words, that, as Paul said, people were making Leonard a patsy.
No, where are you now, though?
Okay, where am I now is first and foremost, my goal is to represent Arlo Looking-Cloud and to keep him safe for doing the right thing. As far as my continuing interest in the case, it's just that. I learned so much about this and other murders that took place. It's my own curiosity that I want to make sure that the information I have is correct. I have a lot of information. I can probably tell you this story, certainly not as well as Paul, but from the beginning to the end. And I'm not trying to discredit anyone. The people involved discredit themselves. And the truth will discredit a number of people. I'm just trying to learn. The truth is based on perspectives. Everyone has their own, tells what in reality occurred through their own perspective, and you have to sift through that and try to come out with what really occurred. And that's my goal, other than making sure that I keep Arlo safe and represent him well and take his matter to the next step. It's just to find out what occurred, and if people get discredited because of it, so be it. But I'm not out to discredit anyone.
I wanted to answer the other Marley Shabala question, and that is who ordered it. I don't think you'll ever find an order. I think you're going to hear, if we had wiretaps, it would be, look, we got a problem and we expect you to take care of it, and it was a collective call. And that was simply after working with this thing, in 1998 on March 21st at 4 a.m. in the morning, I got up out of bed and said, they all know. Rather, they were all pointing fingers at each other all the time. That's in 1994, if you remember anything about the Confederated chapters and people making accusations against each other, and they were all accusing each other of being involved in the murder of Anna Mae, which all emerged at that same time. And at some particular point, it was like they all knew. They all have pieces of information they've known all along, and they can respond to it. They had to have been all involved because they're all covering their own asses in their own way. So, and it's never been about, it's like Barry said too. It's not a question of being vindictive or having an agenda as a journalist. It's that this story is got so many angles. So many people were involved in it from so many places that all their stories, all the important stories that are important to all the people will never be told, ever. But I think we need to get as much as we can on the record, because the dynamics of what have occurred are interesting. Even the dynamics of how our own Native community was deceived to believe in this. I wanted to believe it. The FBI did this. Yeah, they probably did. They could. Therefore, this person is innocent, kind of a mode. It's taken a long time to uncome from that, because where I went, people would look at me and say, well, he's the guy that's doing this. He's doing the job of the FBI.
That's why I asked you. There's two people I kind of figured were you.
Right. But I can tell you this. From where I started to where I ended up, I think our neighborhood snitch is what everyone needs, and we need to support him. That's the grandmother that calls up and says, my uncle is raping my granddaughter, and tells on him. And it's the person that calls in and says, there's a crack house over here that are killing our kids. Okay? We need snitches and rats, and they're my heroes. Because it's the same thing that Denise says. The silence is killing our people. We need to come to the conclusion that nobody's going to ride in here and rescue our communities from all this stuff. We've got to do it ourselves. I'm proud of the fact that it was me and a team of journalists who've exposed the truth about who killed Anna Mae, and the truth, as far as I believe it, about Leonard Peltier. And there's mitigating circumstances then. I still think that the environment, under the right circumstances, that I'm still sympathetic to the environment. If someone can get off a murder in San Francisco for eating a Twinkie, then being involved in a revolutionary uprising at Pine Ridge, in the environment in which many people were killed and died during that time, that there needs to be mitigating circumstances on both sides. So I still have some sympathy there. But Leonard could help himself by helping himself the best. And in the meantime, I think I helped put this person in prison, and he's one of the only people who's come forward and said, look, this is what we did and here's what happened, where everyone else is lying. And that's why my goal at this time is to try to find a way to say, I think Arlo Looking Cloud needs to be commended. He paid the price. He was a good artist. He's a great-great-grandson of American Horse. When they come in at a powwow for grand entry and they carry the American Horse eagle feather staff, Arlo should be carrying it. And what he did is he ended up living under a bridge, drinking and shooting drugs because of what he was involved in. He was used and abused and thrown away, but like so many other people, by the leadership, why they lived in Hilton hotels, why all the other people were living and sleeping on couches and floors and eating in soup kitchens. That we need to speak out about the troops the troops, the sacrifice that the troops, that's why I'm doing this. I think 3,000 people that went to Wounded Knee need to know that there's, according to what I know, 7 people buried there, including Perry Ray Robinson, a black civil rights worker who worked for Martin Luther King and walked with Andrew Young, went to Wounded Knee. And they said he's a loudmouth nigger and he wouldn't pick up a gun, so he has to be a pig. And he's still buried there. And I want something done about it because his kids deserve to know where their father lies and to be able to go there and pay homage to him, like when they brought Anna Mae home. So that's what motivates me a little bit. Brent?
My question is for Mr. Backrack. In as plain terms as possible, how do you feel now about the guilt or innocence of Leonard, given everything that you know?
Let me answer that like a lawyer. I can't comment on the guilt or innocence of Leonard. I don't know anything for a fact, but what I will say, I still believe that as the 10th Circuit said in 2003, that there was government misconduct in connection with his case. And so looking at it purely from a legal standpoint, which is how I have to look at it, he deserved a new trial and deserves what happened to him in court should not happen to any of us. And the problem is, if we let it happen to anyone, it can happen to any of us and it's too late. When the 8th Circuit said that if the jury had seen some of the evidence, including the bullet that was fabricated, they may have had a reasonable doubt. He should have been given a new trial then. I thought the whole criminal system was about reasonable doubt. So if the court said they could have had reasonable doubt, he should have been given a new trial. So from my perspective, his guilt or innocence is really irrelevant. It's the fact that the system didn't give him a fair trial. And whether he is guilty or innocent should have been proven in a fair trial. And I actually don't want to know what happened or not. So as an attorney, if it came into my head what occurred, you just don't want to know sometimes.
I had a real good attorney tell me that one time too. I was just going right along and he goes, "Stop, I don't want to know." I says, "Okay, we got to get out of here. We're way overdue to get out of here. We're really, really hungry. So thank you for joining with us today. We'll be around for a little bit for other follow-up questions on a personal basis, but thanks for joining with us."
The next session starts at 1:30. It's the Google for Journalists, and so Google representative will be